Welcome to Horror Echo. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from and the time. Now, relax and join me on a journey into the unknown. Story 1: The Whispering Shadows. It was a chilly October night, and Samantha had just moved into her new home. The house was old, dating back to the early 1900s, with creaky floors and a sense of history that seemed to haunt every room. Despite its charm, there was something unsettling about it, a feeling she couldn't shake. The first night she stayed, Samantha decided to unpack in the evening to settle in before the weekend. The house creaked with every gust of wind, and every once in a while, she would hear what sounded like faint whispers, too soft to make out the words, but definitely there. She brushed it off, thinking it was just the wind or her imagination, but the whispers grew louder each night. One evening, as she was sitting in the living room, the whispering started again. She stood up and looked around, trying to find the source. That's when she noticed something strange. In the hallway, just at the corner of her vision, shadows flickered and shifted, almost as though they were moving. But when she turned to face them, they would vanish, leaving only the faintest traces of movement on the wall. Curious, she decided to investigate. She went down the hallway, but the shadows disappeared as soon as she stepped closer. Samantha was beginning to feel more and more unsettled. Her logical mind told her it was nothing, just the house settling, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The whispers continued, louder now, and one night, she decided to stay up late to confront whatever was causing it. Sitting in the living room, she waited, watching the shadows in the hallway carefully. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. Her breath became visible in the air, and the whispers turned into full sentences, like a conversation just out of reach. She could hear what sounded like two people talking, but no one was there. And then, in the shadows, she saw them. Figures, not fully formed, but human enough. They were standing in the hallway, staring at her. Samantha froze, unable to move or speak, as one of the figures slowly stepped forward. The voice that came from it was chilling, more like a growl than a whisper. It said only one thing: leave now, or you'll never leave at all. Samantha, terrified, grabbed her things and fled the house. The whispers stopped the moment she stepped outside, but the figures lingered in her mind, their haunting faces burned into her memory. She never returned to that house again. To this day, no one knows what happened there, but local legend has it that the house is cursed, haunted by the shadows of its past. And if you listen carefully on a quiet night, you might just hear the whispers yourself. Story 2: The Woman in the Mirror. It was the first time Jake had ever stayed at his grandmother's house alone. The old house had been in the family for generations, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The house was large and drafty, with heavy curtains that blocked out the sunlight and old portraits hanging on the walls. It was always a place of mystery for Jake, and this time, he was there to take care of some things for his grandmother, who had recently passed away. The first night, Jake decided to explore the house, familiarizing himself with the rooms and their creaky floors. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed an old, full-length mirror in the corner of the hallway. It was framed in tarnished gold, and despite the years of neglect, it still gleamed in the dim light. Jake couldn't remember ever seeing it there before. Curious, he stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. That's when he noticed something strange. His reflection wasn't quite right. It was subtle, but the woman in the reflection seemed to move a little slower than he did. At first, Jake thought it was just the angle or the lighting, but then he noticed her face, pale, hollow, with deep, dark eyes that stared right back at him. He blinked and turned away, shaking his head. Maybe he was just tired. But as he walked past the mirror, he heard a soft, almost inaudible whisper. "Help me!" Jake froze in his tracks. The voice came from the mirror, yet the house was eerily silent. His heart began to race. He turned back slowly to the mirror, and this time, the woman's reflection was staring directly at him. Her lips moved again, and in a voice colder than anything Jake had ever heard, she whispered, "Help me, or I will never leave." Panicked, Jake rushed out of the hallway, trying to push the image of the woman from his mind. But every time he went back to the mirror, her presence was there, lingering, waiting. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept hearing the whispers echoing in his head, a constant reminder of the woman's plea for help. The next morning, he decided to leave. He didn't want to know who she was or what she wanted. Before he left, Jake took one last look at the mirror. To his horror, the woman was still there, but now her reflection was holding a hand up to the glass, as though begging to be freed. Just before Jake turned away for the final time, he swore he saw her reflection move, pressing against the glass, as if trying to reach out. Jake never returned to his grandmother's house. But locals say that the house is still standing, and sometimes, if you stand in front of the old mirror, you might hear a whisper asking for help, just like Jake did. Some believe that the woman in the mirror is still trapped, waiting for someone to set her free. Story 3: The Silent Visitor. Megan had always loved her quiet little apartment in the city. It was small, cozy, and had a perfect view of the park across the street. It was the perfect place to unwind after a long day of work. But over the past week, something started to feel off. It began with little things. At night, she would hear the soft sound of footsteps outside her door, followed by the faintest tapping. She would get up, open the door to check, but no one would be there. Thinking it was just the building settling, she brushed it off. However, the sounds became more frequent. Sometimes, they seemed to happen during the day, while she was home, working on her laptop. Megan would look up, expecting to see a neighbor walking by, but the hallway would be empty. One night, Megan decided to stay up late, determined to get to the bottom of it. She had been working on a report and felt the need to finish it. As the hours passed, the apartment grew quieter and quieter. At around 3 a.m., the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder and closer. It sounded like someone was pacing right outside her door. Curious and a little unnerved, Megan stood up and opened the door, half expecting to find a confused neighbor or maybe an animal. But again, there was no one there. Then, as she was about to close the door, something caught her eye, a shadow moving at the end of the hallway. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her heart race. She stepped cautiously into the hallway, scanning the dark, empty space. But there was nothing. Just as she was about to return to her apartment, she noticed something strange. On the wall across the hallway, there was a faint outline of a person, slightly darker than the surrounding shadows, almost as if it was pressing itself against the wall, trying to remain hidden. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She backed away slowly, but as she did, the shadow seemed to move, sliding across the wall and closer to her door. Terrified, she slammed her door shut and locked it. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. That night, Megan barely slept. The sounds continued, but now they felt more deliberate, almost as if someone, or something, was trying to get her attention. The next day, Megan moved out of the apartment, too shaken to stay another night. She told her friends about the strange occurrences, but they didn't believe her. However, when she went to collect her things a few days later, the landlord told her that the apartment had been vacant for years before she moved in. There had been no other tenants. To this day, Megan has no explanation for what she experienced. But the apartment remains empty, and sometimes, if you walk past it late at night, you might hear the sound of quiet footsteps echoing down the hallway. Story 4: The Man in the Basement. Ryan had just bought his first house. It was a charming, two-story home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind that seemed perfect for starting a family. The house was a little older, but it had character: original hardwood floors, big windows, and a spacious basement. Ryan was excited to start his new life there, but he didn't know that something was waiting for him in the shadows. One evening, after a long day of unpacking boxes, Ryan decided to explore the basement. He had never been down there before, and something about the door had always intrigued him. It was a heavy, old wooden door, unlike the other doors in the house. There was a faint smell of mildew coming from below, but Ryan shrugged it off. He was planning to use the basement for storage anyway. As he descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the darkness felt heavier. Ryan flicked the light switch, but the light flickered on and off, barely illuminating the space. The basement was small, filled with old furniture and boxes covered in dust. As Ryan looked around, he noticed something strange: a wooden chair in the center of the room. It seemed out of place. There were no other pieces of furniture like it. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine. He felt as though someone was watching him. He turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Shaking it off his nerves, he went closer to the chair. That's when he saw it, a piece of paper sticking out from underneath the chair. Cautiously, he bent down and pulled it out. It was a handwritten note, dated several years ago. It read, "Don't sit in the chair. He's still here." Ryan felt his stomach drop. He didn't know what it meant, but the unease in the pit of his stomach grew stronger. He stood up and quickly left the basement, closing the door behind him. That night, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He kept hearing strange noises, scratching, faint footsteps, and a low, almost imperceptible creaking, as if someone was walking around in the basement. Each time he went down to check, there was nothing. But the next night, it got worse. Ryan was in bed when he heard a loud crash coming from the basement. His heart raced. He grabbed a flashlight and rushed downstairs. When he opened the basement door, he froze. The chair was no longer in the center of the room. It had been moved, now sitting near the stairs. The faint smell of mildew was replaced with the unmistakable scent of something rotting. As he stood there, the flashlight flickered, and in the dim light, Ryan saw him, a shadowy figure, standing just beyond the reach of the beam. The figure was tall, wearing a long coat, and its face was hidden in the darkness. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at Ryan. Fear surged through him, and he backed away quickly, slamming the basement door shut. He could hear the sound of the chair scraping against the floor, as if being dragged closer to the door. Ryan never stayed in the house again. He left that night, abandoning all his belongings. The house was sold to another family shortly after, but some say that the new owners reported strange noises coming from the basement, and sometimes they would find the old wooden chair mysteriously moved, as if someone, something, was still sitting in it. Story 5: The Cabin in the Woods. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. Jessica and her friends rented a cabin in the woods, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The cabin was quaint and secluded, with a large stone fireplace and cozy furniture. It seemed like the ideal place to relax, drink some wine, and tell stories around the fire. But the moment they arrived, something felt off. The first evening was peaceful. They spent the night laughing and enjoying each other's company. But as the sun set, and the darkness swallowed the woods. An unsettling feeling began to settle over the group. Jessica noticed that the trees around the cabin seemed to block out the stars, and the wind had a strange, almost eerie howl to it. Around midnight, after they'd all gone to bed, Jessica was awoken by a strange noise, like soft footsteps outside her window. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just an animal, but the noise didn't stop. It got closer, and then she heard a faint tapping on the glass. Frozen with fear, Jessica pulled the covers over her head, hoping it was just her imagination. The next morning, she told her friends about the strange sound, but they laughed it off as nothing. They went on with their day, hiking through the woods and exploring the nearby river, trying to shake the tension from the night before. But that evening, things took a darker turn. After dinner, as they sat around the fire pit outside, they heard something moving in the woods, heavy footsteps, twigs snapping, and the rustle of leaves. It sounded like something large was approaching the cabin. The group grew quiet, staring into the dark woods. Jessica's heart was pounding in her chest. Suddenly, they saw a figure emerge from the trees. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, with a hood that obscured its face. The figure didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at them. The group froze, too terrified to speak or move. Then, without a word, the figure turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. The friends were shaken, but none of them wanted to leave. They figured it was just some weird person, a wanderer perhaps, and nothing to be afraid of. But the next night, things got worse. Jessica woke up to the sound of scraping against the cabin door, followed by low, guttural growls that sent chills down her spine. She bolted upright in bed, her heart racing. She could feel her friends stirring in their rooms, but no one moved to investigate. The noises continued, growing louder, and then the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, scratching at the door. It was desperate, almost frantic. That was enough. The group grabbed their things and ran out of the cabin, leaving everything behind. As they drove away, Jessica glanced back at the cabin one last time. She swore she saw a shadow standing in the window, watching them leave. The cabin was abandoned soon after, and no one knows exactly what happened there. But locals say the woods are cursed, and anyone who dares to stay in that cabin will never be the same. Sometimes, if you drive by on a dark night, you can see a figure standing in the window, waiting for the next group to arrive. Story 6: The Watcher in the Window. Ella had always been a night owl. Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, she enjoyed staying up late to work on her art, sketching by the dim light of her desk lamp. Her bedroom window overlooked a small park across the street, and at night, the park was peaceful and empty, save for the occasional jogger or dog walker. One night, around 2 a.m., Ella was working on a drawing when she noticed something strange. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing in the park, just beyond the tree line. At first, she thought it was a person walking, but when she looked closer, the figure didn't seem to be moving. It was standing completely still, facing her house, and it felt like it was staring directly at her. Ella's heart skipped a beat. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the figure remained, unmoving, in the same spot. Her pulse quickened as she watched it. The figure didn't move a muscle, not even when the wind rustled the branches around it. After a few minutes, Ella pulled away from the window and tried to focus on her drawing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The next night, Ella decided to stay up late again, but this time she kept the blinds half closed, just enough to peek through. Around the same time, 2 a.m., she saw the figure again, standing in the same spot in the park, facing her window. It hadn't moved. It was the same tall, shadowy figure, completely still and staring. Now, Ella was certain. It wasn't just a coincidence. Someone was standing there, watching her every night. The third night, she had had enough. She decided to confront the figure. She waited until 2 a.m., then quietly crept downstairs, grabbed her phone, and went outside to get a closer look. As she stepped into the cold air, she looked across the street to the park. There was no one there. Confused and shaken, Ella checked the park thoroughly. She searched every corner, but the figure was gone. Relieved, she returned to her home, still trying to make sense of it. But as she was about to go back inside, she looked up at her bedroom window, and there, standing behind the glass, was the figure, now in her own house. The figure was standing right behind her, as if it had been inside the whole time, waiting for her to notice. Ella screamed and ran inside, locking every door and window. She never stayed in that house again, leaving as soon as she could. Some say the figure was never human, but a shadow that would follow anyone who stayed too long in that house. And if you ever drive by that neighborhood late at night, you might just see a figure standing by the window, waiting for someone new to watch. Story 7, The Ticking Clock. Tom had always been a fan of antique furniture, and when he stumbled upon a beautifully crafted grandfather clock at a local estate sale, he knew he had to have it. It was large, ornate, with intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story. The owner of the estate warned him that the clock had a strange history, but Tom, not one for superstition, laughed it off and bought it anyway. When he brought it home, he set it up in his living room, admiring how it looked in the corner of the room. The clock was old, but it worked perfectly, ticking steadily, marking the passing of time. For the first few days, everything seemed normal, but soon Tom began to notice something unsettling. Every night, at exactly midnight, the clock would begin to tick louder. At first, it was a small increase in volume, but it quickly grew until it was deafening, echoing throughout the entire house. Tom tried to ignore it, thinking it was just his imagination. But the ticking didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to grow more intense, as though the clock was counting down to something. One night, as the clock struck midnight, the ticking grew so loud that Tom had to cover his ears. But then, something even stranger happened. The clock stopped ticking. The silence that followed was eerie. Tom slowly uncovered his ears and looked at the clock. The hands had frozen at midnight. He walked over to the clock, attempting to restart it, but no matter what he did, the hands wouldn't move. Frustrated, he decided to go to bed, hoping the next day it would work as usual. The next morning, when Tom woke up, he found that the clock was ticking again. But this time, the ticking was different. It was erratic, as though it was out of sync. And when Tom glanced at the time, he saw that it was no longer midnight. The clock had somehow skipped ahead by several hours, and the hands were now pointing to 3 a.m. As the days went on, the clock began to behave more strangely. It started ticking at odd times, jumping forward, and sometimes even ticking backward. But the most unsettling part was when Tom would wake up in the middle of the night to find the clock's hands pointing directly at him, as if it were watching him sleep. One night, Tom couldn't take it any longer. He decided to get rid of the clock. He tried to sell it, but no one would take it, and when he attempted to throw it away, it mysteriously reappeared in his living room the next day. Terrified, Tom left his house and never returned. The house was later sold to a new family, and they reported hearing strange ticking noises coming from the living room, even when the clock was no longer there. It's said that if you're near that house at night, you can still hear the ticking, echoing in the darkness, as if the clock is waiting for someone to listen. Story 8, The Forgotten Room. Sarah had just moved into a charming, old Victorian house in a quiet neighborhood. It was perfect for her. The high ceilings, the antique furniture, and the large windows with a view of the garden made it feel like something out of a storybook. But there was one thing that unsettled her from the start: the locked door at the end of the hallway. The door was an odd one. It was small, compared to the other doors in the house, and it seemed completely out of place. The keyhole was rusty, and the door itself was covered in dust as though it hadn't been opened in years. Sarah didn't think much of it at first. She figured it was just an old storage closet or maybe a room that had been sealed off for a reason. One day, while cleaning, she accidentally knocked a small painting off the wall and noticed a key hidden behind it. The key was old, tarnished, and looked like it belonged to the locked door. Curiosity got the better of her, and Sarah decided to unlock it. As she turned the key, the door creaked open slowly, and a musty smell hit her immediately. The room was pitch black, save for the faint light that seeped through the cracks in the doorframe. She hesitated for a moment, but pushed the door open completely, revealing a small, empty room with faded wallpaper and dust covering every surface. But then, Sarah saw it, a small, wooden box sitting in the corner of the room. It was intricately carved, old, and had a strange aura about it. The box was locked, but there was no key in sight. Against her better judgment, Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to open it. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it in her hands, and for some reason, the room felt colder. Just as she was about to set the box down and leave, she heard something faint, a whisper. It sounded like her name. Sarah. Startled, she spun around, but the room was still empty, save for the dust and the old furniture. Her heart began to race. The whisper sounded like it had come from the box itself. Terrified, she quickly placed the box back in the corner and slammed the door shut. She tried to forget about it, but every night, she could hear the whispering. It wasn't constant, but just enough to keep her awake, a faint Sarah echoing through the house. She tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. A few days later, Sarah decided to call a locksmith to have the door permanently sealed. But when the locksmith arrived and opened the door, the room was completely different. The wallpaper was bright and new, the dust was gone, and the box was missing. It was as if the room had never been locked, never been forgotten. Sarah moved out shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that the house had somehow changed her. To this day, no one knows what happened in that room, but locals say that if you wander near the old Victorian house at night, you might hear a soft whisper calling your name from behind a door that no one can open. Story 9: The Lost Phone. Lena had been looking forward to a relaxing weekend getaway. She and her friends rented a cabin deep in the woods, far away from the noise of the city. The cabin was quaint, nestled near a small lake, surrounded by trees. It seemed like the perfect place to disconnect and enjoy nature. On the second night of their stay, Lena stepped out onto the porch to take in the quiet night air. As she stood there, she noticed something odd, a glowing light coming from the forest. It wasn't the usual glow from a campfire or flashlight, but something much softer, almost like the flicker of a phone screen. Curious, she decided to investigate, thinking perhaps someone else was nearby. She ventured into the trees, following the soft glow until she reached a small clearing. To her shock, she found a phone lying on the ground, its screen illuminated with a pale blue light. The phone didn't look familiar, but it was new, with no signs of wear. Lena hesitated but picked it up, wondering who could have dropped it in the middle of nowhere. As she unlocked the phone, she realized it had no passcode. It was as if someone wanted her to see something. She opened the Photos app and scrolled through the pictures. Most of them were normal landscapes, selfies, and friends. But then she came across a photo that made her blood run cold. It was a picture of herself, taken from behind the trees, with her standing on the porch of the cabin, unaware. Lena's heart raced as she quickly closed the phone and started to walk back toward the cabin. But as she turned to leave, the phone buzzed in her hand. A new message appeared on the screen. "I'm right behind you." Terrified, Lena turned around, but no one was there. The woods were silent, except for the sound of her rapid breathing. She ran back to the cabin, her legs trembling, and slammed the door behind her. When she tried to show the phone to her friends, the screen had gone dark. There were no messages, no pictures, nothing. It was as if the phone had never been used. The next morning, Lena tried to find the phone again in the clearing, but it was gone. The woods were empty, and there was no trace of it. Her friends insisted that she was just imagining things, but Lena couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching her the entire time. When she returned to the city a few days later, Lena tried to forget about the phone. But she couldn't. The memory of that photo, of the message, haunted her every night. And sometimes, just as she was about to fall asleep, she would feel her phone buzz beside her, only to find nothing but a blank screen. Story 10: The Midnight Caller. Katie had recently moved into an apartment on the outskirts of town. It was small, but it had everything she needed: an affordable rent, a quiet neighborhood, and a lovely view of the city skyline. She spent the first few days unpacking and getting settled in, enjoying her new sense of independence. However, a few nights after moving in, Katie began receiving strange phone calls. At first, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary, a few wrong numbers and telemarketers. But then, she started getting calls at exactly midnight, every night, from an unknown number. When she picked up the phone, there was only silence on the other end. At first, Katie tried to ignore it. She figured it was just some random prank or an accidental dial. But the calls continued, every single night. And they always came at midnight. There were no voices, no sounds, just eerie silence. Each time she answered, the silence felt colder, as if someone was standing at the other end, waiting for her to speak first. One night, Katie decided she had had enough. As the clock struck midnight, her phone rang again. She hesitated but answered it, determined to confront whoever was behind these strange calls. "Hello," she said, her voice shaking. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, a voice whispered her name. "Katie." She froze. The voice was soft, barely audible, and it sounded like someone she knew, but she couldn't place it. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Katie, look out the window." Her heart raced, and she slowly turned toward the window, her breath catching in her throat. Outside, in the shadows, she saw a figure standing on the street. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, and he was staring directly at her apartment window. She couldn't make out his face, but she could feel his gaze, cold and calculating. Katie slammed the phone down and rushed to the window, but when she looked outside, the figure was gone. The street was empty, and there was no sign of anyone. Trembling, she checked the locks on her door and windows, convinced that someone had been watching her. The calls didn't stop. Every night at midnight, the phone rang, and every time she answered, the voice would whisper her name, telling her to look out the window. She never saw the figure again, but the calls continued, each one leaving her more and more paranoid. Eventually, Katie couldn't take it anymore. She packed up and left the apartment, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was always watching her. She moved to a different part of the city, far away from the apartment that had haunted her. But the calls didn't stop. They followed her. The moment she got settled into her new home, the phone rang at midnight, the same unknown number, the same whispering voice, Katie. Katie never answered again. Story 11, The Shadow in the Mirror. Olivia had always been fascinated by old antiques, so when she found an antique mirror at a local flea market, she couldn't resist. It was large, framed in tarnished silver, and had an ornate design. The seller told her that the mirror was centuries old and had been passed down through several generations. He warned her that it was rumored to hold strange powers, but Olivia laughed it off as superstition. She placed the mirror in her bedroom, proud of the new addition to her collection. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. But then, strange things began to happen. At night, Olivia would wake up and see a shadow moving in the mirror, even though there was no one else in the room. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light or her imagination. But the shadows became clearer, more distinct, as if someone, or something, was standing behind her in the reflection. Every time she looked into the mirror, the shadow seemed to grow closer, always just out of reach. It was tall, dark, and shapeless, with no discernible features, but Olivia could feel its presence, watching her. One night, after a particularly restless sleep, Olivia woke up to the feeling that someone was standing at the foot of her bed. She slowly opened her eyes, her heart racing, and turned toward the mirror. What she saw made her blood run cold. In the reflection, standing behind her bed, was the shadow. It wasn't just lingering anymore, it was moving, slowly creeping toward her. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the reflection, too terrified to move. The shadow in the mirror was now reaching toward her. Without thinking, she bolted out of bed and turned around, expecting to find someone there. But the room was empty. She quickly glanced back at the mirror, but the shadow had disappeared. The next morning, Olivia decided to investigate the history of the mirror. She searched through old records and came across an unsettling story about the original owner, a woman who had mysteriously disappeared many years ago. It was rumored that the woman had vanished after spending too much time staring into the mirror, as if it had consumed her. Determined to get rid of it, Olivia tried to sell the mirror, but no one would take it. Desperate, she tried to burn it, but the flames would not touch the glass. The mirror seemed to resist every attempt to destroy it. Olivia eventually left her apartment, leaving the mirror behind. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. She heard from the new tenants that the mirror was still in the same place, and they had been experiencing similar terrifying visions. And every time someone tried to get rid of it, the shadow in the mirror would reappear, waiting for its next victim. Some say the mirror still exists, hidden away in a dark corner, waiting for the next person to stare into it, to become trapped within its reflection. Story 12, The Stalker in the Attic. Liam had just moved into an old townhouse on the edge of the city. It wasn't anything special, just a two-bedroom place with creaky floors and a small attic that was barely ever used. Still, it had charm, and the price was right, so he decided to make it his new home. The first few weeks were uneventful. He unpacked, settled in, and enjoyed the peace of his new surroundings. But one night, about a month after moving in, Liam was woken by the sound of strange noises coming from the attic. At first, he thought it was just the house settling, but the noises continued, scratching, dragging, and what sounded like faint footsteps. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was nothing, but the noises grew louder each night. One evening, after a particularly loud series of knocks from above, Liam decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously climbed up to the attic. As he opened the door, a cold gust of air rushed past him, and he shuddered. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with old boxes and forgotten furniture, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. The noises had stopped as soon as he opened the door, and the attic seemed eerily still. Liam turned to leave, but then he noticed something strange. A small piece of paper was stuck to the floor, near a pile of old furniture. He bent down to pick it up, and the handwriting on it made his blood run cold. It read, "I'm still here. Watching." Terrified, Liam hurried back downstairs, locking the attic door behind him. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept hearing faint creaking sounds from above, and it felt like someone was watching him. The next morning, he checked the attic again. Everything seemed normal, but the note was gone. The noises continued every night. Scratching, dragging, footsteps. Sometimes it sounded like someone was pacing back and forth up there. Liam didn't know what to do. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. One night, as he was lying in bed, he heard the door to the attic creak open. Liam froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He got up slowly, tiptoeing toward the attic stairs. He could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, as if someone was waiting for him. He shined the flashlight up into the attic, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Yet, as he looked closer, he saw a shadow moving in the corner of the attic. It was dark, like a human shape, but it seemed to shift in the dim light. In a panic, Liam rushed out of the house, leaving everything behind. He never returned to the townhouse. The house was eventually sold to another family, but they, too, reported strange occurrences. The sounds from the attic persisted, and sometimes, the new owners would find the same note, placed in the exact spot where Liam had found it. The townhouse still stands, and people say if you walk by late at night, you might see a figure standing in the attic window, staring out into the street. Story 13, The Echoing Footsteps. Mia had recently moved into a spacious apartment on the third floor of an old building in the heart of the city. The place had character, large windows with a view of the skyline, vintage wood floors, and high ceilings. It felt like the perfect spot for her to start fresh, away from the noise of her old neighborhood. But from the very first night, something felt off. As Mia was unpacking, she noticed that every time she moved around the apartment, she could hear footsteps above her, heavy, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking around on the fourth floor. But when she checked, the fourth floor was completely empty. The building was old, and the floor above her was locked up and unused. She brushed it off as the building's old structure settling, or maybe some noise from a neighbor on a different floor. But the footsteps continued. Every night, without fail, they echoed above her, heavy and rhythmic, pacing back and forth as if someone was walking around in circles. Mia tried to ignore it, but the sound was relentless. One evening, she decided to confront it. She grabbed her keys, and with a feeling of unease in her stomach, she headed up to the fourth floor. The door to the floor was locked, just as she expected. But when she pressed her ear against the door, she could hear it, the footsteps, clear as day, pacing on the other side. The sound was deafening in the silence of the hallway. Her heart raced. She tried the handle, but the door didn't budge. The footsteps kept going, but they didn't sound like they were getting any closer. Mia stepped back, trying to collect her thoughts. Just as she was about to leave, she heard something that froze her in place, an eerie whisper, faint but distinct, coming from the other side of the door. It sounded like someone was calling her name. Mia. She bolted down the stairs and back into her apartment, locking the door behind her. The footsteps didn't stop, though. They grew louder and more erratic, as though someone was pacing faster, moving toward her. Mia couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her phone and called the building superintendent. When he arrived the next morning, Mia told him everything. He seemed puzzled, but when he unlocked the door to the fourth floor, he found it empty, just like it had been for years. No one had lived there for a long time, and there were no signs of anything unusual. The footsteps, however, continued every night, just as before, pacing endlessly above her. Mia eventually moved out of the apartment, but the new tenants reported hearing the same heavy footsteps above them, echoing through the halls at night, never stopping, never fading away. To this day, the building remains standing. And if you pass by it late at night, you might just hear the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, pacing back and forth, echoing through the silence. Story 14, The Silent Passenger. Ben had been working the night shift at a small convenience store on the outskirts of town for nearly a month. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and the quiet hours allowed him to catch up on his reading and music. The store was off the beaten path, with only a few cars stopping by throughout the night. One evening, a heavy rainstorm swept through the area, and the store seemed emptier than usual. As the clock struck midnight, Ben glanced out the front window, watching the rain pour down in sheets. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the gentle tapping of the rain against the glass. Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled, signaling that someone had entered. Ben looked up, expecting to see a customer, but the store was still empty. Confused, he glanced around the aisles. But then, something caught his eye, a figure sitting at the counter near the back of the store. It was a man, dressed in a long, dark coat, his head lowered, hiding his face. The man was motionless, not saying a word, and he didn't seem to have come in through the door. Ben felt a shiver run down his spine. He cautiously walked over to the counter, asking if the man needed anything. The figure didn't respond. Ben cleared his throat and asked again, but still no reply. Growing more uneasy, he reached out to tap the man's shoulder. As his hand neared the figure, Ben's heart raced. There was no warmth, no breathing. It was as if the man wasn't alive at all. Panicking, Ben quickly stepped back. The man remained motionless, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his hat. As Ben turned to call for help, the figure suddenly stood up, brushing past him, as though nothing had happened. Ben spun around, trying to follow the man, but when he reached the door, the rain had stopped. The street outside was completely still, no sign of anyone. Shaking, Ben locked the store's door and stayed near the counter for the rest of his shift. He kept glancing at the spot where the man had sat, but the memories of the chilling encounter stayed with him long after the night ended. The next evening, Ben was still uneasy as he returned to the store. But when he entered, the first thing he noticed was the same man's figure sitting at the counter again. The same dark coat, the same lowered head. And just like before, the figure didn't move, didn't speak. Ben ran out without a word. No one ever saw the man again, but some say that on stormy nights, if you're driving down the road near that convenience store, you might spot someone sitting in the window, waiting for the next lonely passenger to walk in. Story 15, The Unseen Visitor. Laura had been living in her new apartment for only a few weeks. It was small, but it had everything she needed, cozy, quiet, and tucked away in a corner of the city. But from the moment she moved in, there was something unsettling about the place. The air always felt heavy, and the halls were unnervingly silent. She attributed it to the building's age, telling herself it was just the normal creaks and groans of an old structure. However, the strange occurrences started happening soon after. Every night, just as Laura was about to fall asleep, she would hear faint footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment. She tried to brush it off, assuming it was just the neighbors, but the sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate. It felt as if someone was walking right outside her door, stopping only when she tried to get up and check. One evening, the footsteps grew louder. They sounded like they were getting closer, closer to her door, until they stopped just outside. Laura's heart began to race. She waited, but the sound of footsteps never moved away. She gathered the courage to open the door, but when she did, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, just the faint hum of the old light overhead. Confused and frightened, Laura decided to spend the night in the living room, away from the door. As she lay there, wide awake, she heard the footsteps again, this time, from inside her apartment. They were slow, soft, like someone walking just out of view. The next morning, Laura was too terrified to even look around the apartment. She was afraid of what she might find. Over the next few days, the strange noises only escalated. The footsteps became more frequent, and sometimes, she would hear the faint sound of someone whispering, but when she tried to focus, the whispers stopped. Then, one night, as Laura sat at her desk, she noticed something chilling. In the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow move across the room. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned, but there was nothing there. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. She decided to investigate further, checking the closets, the windows, the rooms. Everything was exactly as it should be, until she opened the closet door in her bedroom. The air inside was unnaturally cold, and something about the room felt wrong. That's when she saw it, a small, old mirror propped up in the corner, hidden behind some boxes. Laura had never seen it before, but it was oddly familiar. As she stared into the mirror, her reflection seemed to change. The room behind her in the reflection didn't look like her apartment at all. It was dark, unfamiliar, and the shadows seemed to move, just like the ones she had seen out of the corner of her eye. Panicked, she shoved the mirror away and left the apartment, unable to return that night. She later found out that the previous tenant had disappeared without a trace, and the apartment had remained vacant for months before she moved in. To this day, no one knows who, or what, was in that apartment with Laura. Some say the figure she saw in the mirror was not just a reflection, but something else, watching from the other side. And if you listen closely, you might still hear the footsteps echoing in the halls late at night. Story 16, The Last Train. Jake was running late that evening. The last train to his small town was leaving soon, and if he missed it, he'd have to wait until morning for the next one. He rushed through the dimly lit station, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. It was unusually quiet for such a busy station, but Jake didn't think much of it. He was just focused on getting to the platform. When he arrived at the platform, the train was already there, waiting. The doors were open, but there were no other passengers in sight. The train was old, the metal worn, and the interior lights flickered, but Jake didn't care. He was tired and just wanted to get home. He stepped inside, choosing an empty seat near the back of the train. The doors closed, and the train began to move. As it rolled through the dark countryside, Jake noticed something strange. The train was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of people chatting or the usual rustling of newspapers. The only sound was the distant rumble of the tracks beneath. It felt like something was wrong, but Jake couldn't put his finger on it. He glanced around, but the train remained empty. A cold chill crept up his spine, and he looked out the window, trying to distract himself. But what he saw through the glass made his heart skip a beat. There was another train, right next to his, moving at the same speed. It wasn't another train from the station, this one seemed to be coming from nowhere. The train next to him was dark, the windows pitch black. Jake squinted, trying to see inside, but all he could make out were vague shapes moving within, figures shifting in the shadows. The figures in the train didn't seem to notice him. They just moved in a slow, steady rhythm, almost like a dance, never facing him, never reacting to his presence. The train, with its strange passengers, was matching Jake's train speed for speed, as if they were locked in some unspoken race. As the train moved on, the other train drew closer. The air in Jake's train became colder, and he began to hear faint whispering. He glanced around, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, coming from the empty seats, then from all around him, as if the voices were coming from the train itself. Jake was beginning to panic, his breath visible in the cold air. He stood up and ran toward the doors, hoping to escape whatever was going on, but the doors wouldn't open. The train continued to speed down the tracks, and the other train was now almost beside him, the figures inside growing clearer. They were not human. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and black, staring straight at him. They were motionless, unblinking, except for one, the figure at the front, standing with its hand pressed to the glass, staring right at Jake. He screamed and tried to open the door again, but it remained shut. The train started to slow, and as it did, the other train began to pull away, vanishing into the darkness like a distant memory. By the time Jake finally arrived at his stop, the train was empty, the air still cold, and the whispering had stopped. The station was dark, and there was no sign of the train that had been beside him. He stepped off the train, trembling, and looked back at the platform. The train was gone, and the tracks were silent. The last train was always the last one to arrive. Story 17, The Watcher at the Window. Jessica had always loved her apartment. It was small, cozy, and situated in a quiet neighborhood with a great view of the city skyline. She spent her evenings relaxing by the window, watching the sun set behind the tall buildings. It was a peaceful routine, one she cherished after long days at work. But one evening, as she sat by the window, something felt off. She had the blinds partially open, and as the last rays of sunlight faded, she noticed a figure standing across the street, staring directly at her apartment. It wasn't unusual for people to walk by, but this figure stood perfectly still, too still, as if waiting for something. At first, Jessica dismissed it as her imagination. Maybe it was just someone lost in thought, but the longer she looked, the more uncomfortable she became. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at her apartment with unsettling intensity. She felt like they were watching her, waiting for her to do something. The next night, as she sat by the window again, the figure was there once more, standing in the exact same spot across the street. Jessica's heart began to race. How could they be in the same position? It was as if they'd been waiting there all day, as though they knew she would be at the window at that exact moment. She quickly closed the blinds, trying to shake off the creeping anxiety. The figure didn't seem to move, but she could still feel their presence, like an invisible weight pressing down on her. That night, she barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of the strange figure. The following night, she made a conscious effort not to sit by the window, but the feeling of being watched never left her. Every time she glanced toward the window, she could almost feel the presence of the figure standing there, even though she didn't dare open the blinds. Then, one night, she decided to confront it. She opened the blinds just enough to see across the street. The figure was still there, but this time, it was closer, standing beneath a street lamp. Jessica could make out a shadowy outline, but the figure's face was hidden in the darkness. Suddenly, the figure moved, slowly approaching her apartment. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away from the window. She could hear footsteps coming closer, each one making her pulse race faster. With trembling hands, Jessica picked up her phone and called the police, but before she could finish dialing, the footsteps stopped. She peeked through the blinds and saw nothing. The street outside was empty, as if the figure had vanished into thin air. The police arrived shortly after, but they found no sign of anyone suspicious. The street was still and quiet, just like it had always been. However, from that night forward, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she looked out the window, she half expected to see that same figure standing across the street, staring into her apartment. But the most unsettling part? Every time she checked the window, it seemed like the figure had always been there, waiting. Story 18, The Vanishing Neighbors. Sarah had just moved into a charming apartment building on the edge of town. It was an old, but well-kept building, with classic architecture and a sense of history. The neighbors were friendly enough, and Sarah quickly settled in, feeling comfortable in her new home. However, as the weeks went by, she began to notice something strange. Every few days, a neighbor would disappear. At first, it seemed like just coincidences, people moving out, leaving no trace. But it started to happen more frequently. One week, the elderly couple across the hall were gone without a word. Their apartment was cleared out, everything was gone. Sarah thought it odd, but she figured they had simply moved or maybe went on an extended trip. But then, another neighbor disappeared. This time, it was a young man who lived next door to Sarah. His apartment was empty, no sign of him, and there was no notice about his departure. The building management was tight-lipped, and no one seemed to know what was going on. Sarah began to feel uneasy. The building, once so full of life, now felt eerily quiet. The sounds of neighbors talking, footsteps in the hall, the smell of dinner cooking, all those little signs of life, began to fade. There were no explanations. No one talked about the disappearances. One night, as Sarah sat in her apartment, she heard the sound of footsteps in the hall. She paused, listening closely, wondering who else was left in the building. She stood up and opened her door, but when she looked down the hall, there was no one there. The footsteps had stopped. The next morning, Sarah went out to run some errands. When she returned, she was greeted by an unsettling sight. The building seemed different. The walls were freshly painted, the hallway lights were brighter, and the air felt colder. She stopped in front of her neighbor's apartment, the one where the young man had lived. The door was wide open, and the apartment was fully furnished, just like it had been before he vanished. Confused and shaken, Sarah called the building manager. The manager assured her that everything was normal, that the apartment was always in use and nothing strange had been going on. But when Sarah asked about the disappearances, the manager grew tense and quickly changed the subject. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept hearing soft knocking sounds coming from the walls, like whispers traveling through the pipes. And every time she looked out the window, the street below seemed emptier than usual. It was like something was missing. In the middle of the night, Sarah heard a loud knock on her door. She hesitated, then opened it cautiously. Standing there was a figure, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform. The person didn't speak, just stared at her, unblinking. Before Sarah could say anything, the figure turned and walked down the hall, disappearing into the darkness. The knocking sound started again, but this time, it came from inside her own apartment, soft, rhythmic, as if someone was tapping on the walls. The silence that followed was even worse. The next morning, Sarah packed her things and left. She never looked back, but the thought of those vanishing neighbors haunted her. To this day, no one has moved into the empty apartments, and the building remains just as silent as the night Sarah left. Story 19. The Creeping Darkness. Rachel had always been a fan of quiet, peaceful evenings at home. She lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense trees and fields. The isolation was something she cherished, offering her a sense of calm after a long day. Her house was cozy, with big windows that allowed her to look out over the vast fields and forest beyond. One evening, as Rachel settled in with a book, she noticed something strange. The sky outside had grown darker than usual, the clouds thick and heavy, as if a storm was rolling in. But the odd thing was that she didn't hear the usual sounds of thunder or wind. It was as though the world had gone completely silent. Rachel got up and walked to the window to see if she could spot any signs of the approaching storm, but as she peered out, she noticed a shadow moving across the field, heading toward her house. It wasn't an animal, but rather a large, dark mass, creeping slowly, almost gliding along the ground. Her heart began to race as the shadow got closer. She watched in horror as it reached the edge of the yard and seemed to pause for a moment, as if aware she was watching. The shadow didn't make a sound, and it didn't cast any light. It was simply there, stretching across the grass like a living darkness. Rachel tried to shake off the fear, telling herself it was probably just the way the light was shifting, or maybe some sort of optical illusion. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The figure stayed there, unmoving, until she finally stepped away from the window. A few minutes later, Rachel heard a faint tapping on the window. It was soft at first, then grew louder, as though something was trying to get her attention. She froze. She didn't dare look out the window again, but the tapping continued, slow, methodical, persistent. The shadow outside grew more distinct, and Rachel could see it now, shifting and moving as if it were trying to crawl its way toward her. But when she glanced at the window again, it was gone. The tapping stopped. The yard was empty. Rachel felt a sudden chill, the temperature in the house dropping unnaturally cold. As she turned to leave the room, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye. A figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, blacker than any shadow she had ever seen, and it loomed there, motionless, as though it had always been there, waiting. Her pulse quickened, and she backed away slowly, her breath shallow. The figure didn't move, but it was closer than before, and the darkness around it seemed to grow. Suddenly, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging Rachel into complete darkness. The only thing she could hear was her own frantic breathing, and the soft shuffle of something moving closer in the dark. Panicking, Rachel ran to the door, but as she reached for the handle, the figure appeared in front of her, blocking the exit. It was taller now, the darkness surrounding it thick and suffocating. It made no sound, but Rachel could feel it pressing in on her, as if it were trying to suffocate the light. Terrified, she stumbled back, and in a panic, she ran to the back door. But as she opened it, the cold air hit her face, and she saw nothing. The yard was empty. No shadow, no figure, nothing at all. After that night, Rachel couldn't stay in the house any longer. She packed up and left, never looking back. Some say that the house still stands, but if you drive by on a stormy night, you might see a tall, dark shadow creeping across the yard, waiting for someone to look out the window. Story 20. The Door That Wouldn't Open. Elliot had always loved the old house he had inherited from his late uncle. It was a large, Victorian-style home with creaky floors, antique furniture, and a sprawling garden out back. Despite its age, it felt warm and inviting, except for one thing. There was a door in the attic that was always locked. Elliot had never paid much attention to it, assuming it was just another room full of old furniture and forgotten items. But over time, the door started to intrigue him. It was a heavy, solid wooden door with an intricate iron handle. The lock was old, but it wasn't rusted, and the key was nowhere to be found. He asked the neighbors if they knew anything about it, but they only looked at him with strange expressions and changed the subject. One rainy afternoon, unable to ignore his curiosity any longer, Elliot decided to break the lock and open the door. He spent hours searching through the house for tools before finally settling on a crowbar. He pried the lock open, the creaking sound of the metal echoing through the silent house. The door swung open, and Elliot was met with an overwhelming darkness. He stepped inside, flicking on the light. To his surprise, the room wasn't full of old furniture at all. It was empty, save for a single, dusty armchair sitting in the center of the room. It looked out of place, like it had been placed there intentionally. Elliot approached it, feeling the strange weight of the room pressing in on him. There was no reason for it to be there, no reason for the room to exist. But as he reached out to touch the arm of the chair, he heard a faint whisper. At first, Elliot thought it was the wind, but the whisper came again, this time clearer, as if someone was standing right behind him. Leave. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he whipped around, but the room was still empty. No one was there. He backed away from the chair, his heart racing. The whisper had been so real. He quickly left the room, slamming the door shut behind him and locking it again. He decided to forget about the room, forget about the chair. But every time he passed by the attic door, the whisper echoed in his mind. That night, Elliot couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the chair, and he could hear the whisper calling to him, urging him to return. It wasn't until the third night that he could no longer resist. He grabbed the crowbar again and returned to the attic. This time, when he opened the door, there was no armchair. Instead, the room was completely dark, except for one thing, a figure standing in the corner. Elliot froze, unable to speak, unable to move. The figure was tall, dressed in what appeared to be a tattered coat. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its eyes, if they were even eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness. "Why did you come back?" the figure whispered. The voice was low, haunting, as though it didn't come from a person at all. Without warning, Elliot slammed the door shut and locked it again, his breath coming in short gasps. He never opened the door again. The house, once warm and comforting, felt cold and suffocating. Every night, he heard the whispering from the attic, urging him to come back. Elliot left the house soon after, unable to bear the pressure of the whispering any longer. But when the house was sold to new owners, they reported strange noises from the attic, soft whispers, faint scratching sounds, and sometimes, the echo of footsteps. No one knows what's in that attic now, but people say that if you're brave enough to stay the night, you might hear the whispers too. And if you listen closely, you might even be invited to sit in the chair. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.